from saying, we are actually looking to invest in rupees, not dollars, because anything beyond a 2-year hedge is prohibitively expensive anyway. Any comments on this?
See, one of the key things which Canadian investor would appreciate initially is that there is a good enough hedging window available to them for the initial, 2 to 3 years, maybe 5 years, so that they can have predictable returns, in dollar terms. And once they get comfort on the currency over a span of 5 years, they would realize that the premium which they are paying on dollar rupee for 5 years, say 5% or 6%, is not worth paying. They're better off rather than giving that return to their investors and investing in rupee. But initially, to bring them on board, the mechanism of providing a stable and predictable returns and providing them a window where you can hedge at least initially 5 years would help them a lot.
Right, so we are at 3:15, and unless there are any other questions, I'll just sum it up so that we can move on. Any other questions? Right, so we started by trying to answer the question, what's it going to take to get Canadian dollars into Indian infrastructure? And I'd just like to repeat what Vikram, you began with. We said no greenfield money is going to come in, not for new projects in India, not for the brain damage phase of infrastructure creation, but brownfield, and especially where cash flow visibility is assured. Canadian pensions have not invested in non-OECD countries. So if we can give them a completely risk mitigated cash flow based product, it's no longer about infrastructure, it's about cash flows. Right? We said that if there are assets that you can invest in, and we have an inventory of such assets over the last 5 years, if you can have transparent mechanisms, and let me just add one element here. It need not be private investment in infrastructure. It can be government assets in infrastructure. There is a whole lot of government assets in India in infrastructure which are cash flow yielding for the last 10 years. And because the government in India is very scared of various Cs, CAGs and CBIs, it will probably not be able to make a deal with the private sector. But a state-owned pension plan trying to buy a government asset in infrastructure, it will happen. So on that note, I'll leave you. Thank you for investing your time with us. I hope the panel provided you adequate returns. Thank you.
Really enjoyed it and had a good perspective. May I ask Mr. Rontu Basu, Vice President of the Canadian Business Chamber, to just present mementos to our speakers.
Yeah, I mean, so, okay.
Keeping us all under control.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nazira. I think the interest in our session is a little bit limited. You've allowed everybody to escape, it seems.
No, I think the challenge is now going to be to get them from the tea coffee stage back, and Shailesh especially stayed
Yes,
back.
and I must appreciate Shailesh, who's decided under pain of death to remain behind and listen to what we have to say. So, thanks Shailesh, we publicly with that. Okay, so our session after the morning session and the very interesting session that Shailesh conducted on financing options, possibilities, opportunities in the infrastructure sector, we are going to talk about much more mundane stuff which relates to regulations and regulatory aspects, and it's something that none of us want, shall we say, but all of us must have. And definitely the attractiveness of any country, and I'm talking about a country here because, I mean, this is, we've all got together keeping in mind Indo-Canadian possibilities of collaboration, and we're talking about, so obviously the sector attractiveness, as I was saying, is a function function of the regulations that one has, both in terms of holding back what investors may like to do, shall I say, and I say that with inverted commas, shall I say, as well as in how safe and secure a sector is for investment in a country. And we did hear a bit about some of the regulatory aspects when we were discussing, when Shailesh was talking about the financing, financing aspects of the infrastructure. And infrastructure in India is somewhat regulated and somewhat not regulated. So we have regulators which have very well developed regulators in some of the sectors, in the sense that it's been around for a while. There's been a lot of learning to be had by experience within India. For example, I've had a lot of exposure to the oil and gas sector, for example, the power sector. These are some of the sectors which we've seen a lot of development, a lot of thought process go through. One has learned from mistakes, and I am told, though I'm going to actually address this question to one of my panelists shortly, that in some of these sectors, we do have a regulatory environment, regulatory framework, which is almost world-class, shall we say, which should be as good, as well thought out as one would see other geographies. But, of course, that could be a point of contention. And to begin with, let me just quickly introduce the panelists that I have here. Without exception, the panelists, both on my left and my right, are super experts in what the regulatory aspects of the sector are. So it makes my task easy. For a change, I was mentioning this earlier, I have to do less of the talking and I've got to get other people to talk. And in most instances, I'm often told I'm the one who can't keep quiet. So this occasion is a challenge for me in that sense. So to begin with, if I were to introduce Amit Pandurangi, he's the senior director with Deloitte. Basically, he's the leader of our infrastructure practice. So he's really a guru. When we were discussing whether I should be on the panel, I think he should be basically leading the panel, but it's more worthwhile to hear him talk, I would imagine. He has over 30 years of experience in the sector, which is on transportation, which includes aviation, ports, roads, railways, logistics, you name it, I think he's had experience in. More importantly, he's been associated with policy making, so he's actually sat with the policy makers to determine what are appropriate tariff structures, etc. So he comes with a wealth of experience, which he will have the occasion to share with us. On my left, right next to Amit, is Nicholas Banerjee Gurgur. Did I pronounce that right? All right. He is the head of groups, contracts, legal and governmental affairs for Bhatia. And I'm sure he'll have a lot to share with us on some of the opportunities and, more importantly, some of the challenges within the regulatory aspects. I guess this is what he does for a living, that he's had occasion to deal with. And he did mention he'd want to spend some time talking about the public procurement bill, which is expected to be coming up. Thereafter, on my right, I have Dr. Harsh Kumar Bhandara. I was very impressed with your credentials, Dr. Bhandara, I must say. And I asked him how I should address him. He said Harsh, so I will call him Harsh. Not Harsh, yes. So Harsh is basically the executive director at IIFCL, which are right in the center of infrastructure financing. And you will get to hear more about some of the regulatory aspects and regulatory concerns and regulatory challenges he's had relating to financing. So which was, I guess, a little bit of an overlap from where the last session led off. And last but not the least, I've got Kemal here with me, Kemal Mehta. He's for my tax practice, and he has almost 15 years of experience, or 30, I'm making you older than you are, in M&A field, in private equity, in financing. And our clients love him because he helps them figure out the tax efficiencies of the investments, and he makes sure they stay out of trouble. Possibly he has a hard job of convincing them sometimes of what are some of the concerns that need to be borne in mind, what are some of the risks that need to be taken care of. And I guess he will be talking about financing and concerns around regulations coming in for equity financing, coming in for debt financing, both for international and Indian investors. So I'm going to go back to my left, Amit. I have a question of you, which is really, we understand as much, I mean, there are varying numbers, and some say $1.7 trillion is what we need, which is almost equivalent to the size of our current economy in the India infrastructure space over the next 10 years. I was reading up some of the statistics. So my question is that to your mind, what are basically, when investors are looking at India, Indian investors, or when the Canadians are looking at investing in the India infrastructure space, what would you think that they look for? What, in your experience, have they told us this is what we want, and if they have this, then we're coming right in and making these investments?
Yeah, there are many things that any investor would look for when entering a country or when entering a new project. And so I'll limit my response to the regulatory part of it, since this session is more about regulatory. So we won't worry too much about the market and the viability and so on, which are of course the minimum givens that any investor would look for. But from a regulatory perspective in the infrastructure space, what we have seen repeatedly is that they look for primarily a certainty of regulation. They do not want to be surprised every year, every 2 years after they have taken a decision to come into the country. They would like to know what the rules of the game are for the next 10, 15, 20 years. They don't want to know what the rules of the game are for next 2 years, because they do find that understanding what the regulations are in each of these infrastructure sector where they're considering it's a fairly long and complex process. But just as you are able to figure out what this regulation is all about, if somebody starts changing the rules of the game, they say, look, we can't make up our mind about a long-term investment if somebody in the government, for whatever political or other reasons, is going to start making changes. Significant changes or minor changes. Changes are changes. We don't like them. So this is one important point that we look for. And of course, second, I would just like to add that they look for clarity in regulation. They don't really want to say that regulation should be like this or like that, but they want to say that, look, if I read a document of the government which says this is how this sector will be regulated, that's how it should be. It should not be kept very vague and, interministerial argument goes on about where the comma should be, as you would have read in the paper this morning on the aviation sector. There is an argument going on about what is the meaning of a comma in between two words. Now come on, as an investor, if I'm coming in and putting in $200 million, $400 million, whether as a financier, developer, operator, whatever, the last thing I want is to be told that because of some interpretation issue between a full stop and a comma, my decision is completely wrong. So they want clarity. Clarity on the interpretation, clarity on the applicability, clarity between the states and the center, because there are many sectors which are regulated by both state and center. So who regulates? Who is my regulator? Is it the state regulator? Is it the central regulator? Is it both? Who is it that I have to go to? So these are two important aspects, and I'm sure there are more, but I'll sort of pick it up as we go along.
Okay. Nicola, moving from there, how long have you been here in India?
Quite some time. In and out, I would say about 10 years.
Also 10 years, so as long as you can get, I guess. And what would you identify as, Amrit says that clarity and consistency, I guess, or certainty is the term we use. I think two important aspects for anybody looking to invest. You, from Bhatia, probably come in as suppliers or vendors to the sector. So what, in your mind, besides these two aspects that Amrit mentioned, would be some of the concerns that you would have had as a potential supplier or an existing supplier to the sector?
I think, just to add to what Amrit had mentioned, certainly you need clarity, and then what you also need in any regulatory framework is applicability of the regulatory framework. How is it applied? Is it applied consistently, or is it applied inconsistently? What we have seen as industry is that, of course, once you have a piece of documentation, legislation, regulation, it can be interpreted very differently. And I think there's never in law, as we say as lawyers, there's never a clear black and white position. But what the industry does need is this clarity in the application of the legislation and regulatory framework. What we have seen in various amounts of sectors, I can give you one example. As we are aware, most recently the Finance Ministry approved a bill on indirect tax and tax offenders in terms of tax evasion.
I can tell you since this morning, since the article appeared, I have received in total 12 calls from corporate office, group office, president's office, general counsel's office on the application of how will this be applied. And I think that in any new piece of legislation you need clarity and applicability.
So, would you think the impending public procurement bill in any manner will be a step in the direction to have perhaps address some of these concerns, including clarity, applicability, consistency? Do you think that helps?
Absolutely. What we've seen mostly in Bombardier, obviously we supply aircrafts mostly to the private sector, but now there are opportunities into the public sector as well. If I think also of the transportation side, on the rolling stock, locomotive signaling for the railway sector, I think the public procurement bill that has been approved by Cabinet Committee in 2012 brings some form of, I would say, a silver lining in the cloud. What we have observed as industry is at times in certain projects, again, certain industries, you do observe a lack of timeliness, transparency, again, applicability in any government procurement tender. And I think that for the corporations to try to understand India and its intricities, which is multiple in India, I think it gives a comfort that yes, this new bill will potentially be enacted by Parliament. I think it's a step in the right direction. The public procurement law in itself needs to be, again, discussed in industry. There needs to be comments that have to be assembled in terms of applicability of penalties, application of consistencies. And once the public procurement law gives you a basis on government procurement tenders, how would the ministries interpret it? And then comes policy, right? Because once you have the regulatory framework, you need to have policy within the different ministries. So if I think as an example of Bombardier wanting to invest on the long term as it has since 1996, and continue to invest in resources, allocation of revenue, new factories that are built throughout India, what we need to see is three aspects. It's transparency in the process of government procurement tenders, applicability of the regulatory framework, and timeliness of the government procurement tender.
Thank you. Harshan, without going back to the kinds of financing instruments one can look at and what are the possibilities of different instruments, to you, in your mind, from the regulatory side, from the regulatory issues, what are some of the key concerns that you see, and also what do you think could be done about those?
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. First of all, let me say, from the financing perspective, India has a good history of the financial institutions being in place. And there is a very good regulator who at times defies even the government or the expectations of the government. And for the sake of holding its regulatory well-laid-out principles. So that's the strength of this country. And over the years, it has adopted world-class practices, be it capital adequacy norms, be it provisioning norms, be it the concentration, sectoral concentration norms they have been advising. Also, they have been promoting through various guidelines I would say, corporate governance practices within the banks and the non-bank companies as well. So I personally feel the regulator, Reserve Bank of India, which is the prime regulator for the financial system, which regulates the banking system and non-bank companies which are lending to infrastructure space, has been fairly regular, consistent, and evolving. And evolving for the good. But yes, I see something, certain aspects, particularly relating to capital markets, because we have a separate regulator. SEBI, it is doing its bit for even debt funds. It's in the process of evolving the guidelines, and once they are there, then we have to also see whether the policy and the developmental aspects are well addressed through the But at the same time, financing comes as a mediation, as it's not an end. So all other regulatory things also affect us, as long as absence of regulators in some sectors, we feel should be well addressed to protect the interests of the financial system. Also, we should have very quick adjudication processes wherever the regulators are there. So there has to be a very down procedure which is time bound, and which is, as I fully agree with him, which is to be fairly applicable. It has to be seen. It has to be consistent, and I think there is scope for improvement there. Other than this, I would say for infrastructure financing, we have been introducing newer financial instruments, financial mechanisms for so that the infrastructure financing gets attractive not only to domestic investors as well as to foreign investors. Various measures have been taken which are fiscal as well as non-fiscal. I would say from my side, because it will be a bit often taking off from what the earlier panel was talking about, we have to introduce some of the concepts which are unique and which will require, because we are a government-based, fully 100% government-owned institution, which offers opportunities for investors, which are during the later part of the interaction, I will take them forward.
Himal, to take that forward, would you, how would you rate, shall we say, the framework that we have for foreign direct investment into the country? Is that something which, in your experience in interaction with your clients, you find is considered attractive? And so I can't only be negative and talk only about the challenges, so I'm going to talk about ask you to talk about some of the strengths. And equally importantly, of course, what are some of the concerns and challenges that you find the investors face? So let's have a understanding of the international investors of their concerns to be.
Sure. So before I go on the negative side of the discussion, let me talk about positives. Infrastructure, as you all know, it's a priority sector for this country, and hence there are a lot of manner in which the regulators have framed the foreign investment policies, where the funds can be invested in India in multiple ways. So foreign direct investment, we spoke about equity investment. The ECB route, which is a debt investment, is also quite open for infrastructure sector. There's a new route which has opened up recently, about 6 or 8 months back, which is a qualified foreign investor. Through that route also, an investment can come into the infrastructure sector. So in the previous discussion, we had one discussion saying that whether the investment should be done by equity or by a debt fund, and the analysis was that a lot of people would like to take equity risk because they are long-term players, maybe 20, 25 years plus players. Same could be structured differently to give them underlying security or a guarantee to make sure that they don't lose confidence in the country. So it may be an equity return, but done in a way which gives them a debt product. So I think there are a host of different manner of investment routes which are available. So that's a positive side. The negative side, which Amrit and Nicholas has rightly voiced, is the inconsistency in the regulation. So tax laws, basically. And there are a couple of tax laws which has changed over a period of time. And I'm not going to talk about Vodafone retrospective effect because it has been spoken any number of times. The issue is that a simple tax holiday period for a power sector or for any infrastructure sector, which is like 10 years tax holiday in 20 years time or 15 years time, is still subject to the minimum alternate tax method. And this fiscal budget was an expectation that they will probably change it, but it has not gone through. The only benefit they have given is that maybe a long-term infrastructure that can be taken at a very minimal withholding tax rate, which is 5%. So these are or bad news or good news on the tax front.
Bad news or good news? Amrit, can I ask you to throw some light on the, I shouldn't call them subsectors because they're such large sectors themselves, but some of these sectors within infrastructure. So specifically, how would you rate or how would you look at the regulatory framework and the regulations in some of the subsectors, perhaps power, perhaps transportation? Within transportation, it would be railways. We still have a lot of private participation to come in. But how would you look at some of these sectors? Would you say far better structured in the framework than the others are?
Well, on the regulatory path, I think different sectors are clearly at completely different points at any point in time. To give you an example, there are sectors where we have no regulation at all. By default, therefore, government is the regulator, the department which formulates the policy is also the regulator. If you take, for example, the road sector, there is no separate regulator as such. It is the Ministry of Roads which actually is the regulator. Or if you take water sector, where again a lot of investment is expected over the next few years, either public or private, we don't have a regulator. Some attempts are being made here and there to bring in a regulator, but we don't. As against that, if you see, say, telecom sector, I mean, we have an extremely active regulator. Power sector, we have innumerable number of regulators. We have central regulator, we have state regulator, we have technical regulator, we have commercial regulator. I mean, a whole lot of them. It takes a long time to figure out how many of them are there. If you take the oil and gas sector, we again have technical and commercial separate, with very thin lines of difference sometimes between who is actually supposed to be regulating a particular aspect, because ministry says this is not your job, regulator says no, this is my job, and it keeps going on back and forth. So there are differences in different sectors, but on a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10, I would uniformly put across any of these sectors as anywhere below 5, never above 5, assuming 10 to be the best. So clearly we are way behind in what where we should be, because sometimes these regulators are not really independent as they're supposed to be. They have become somewhat politicized. If you look at the power sector regulator, one can't believe that most of the state regulators are really independent, applying their mind on economic principles. We can't really say that. As against that, we have some sectors which are extremely active and applying the results fully. We also have in recent times the additional issue that has come up as to what is going to be done by the competition commissioner and what is going to be done by a sector regulator. Many issues are in the nature of competition, and therefore is it the realm of competition commissioner or is it in the realm of the regulator? And we do have an appellate mechanism in most of these which is good on paper but not working at all in practice. Some of the appellate tribunals don't exist. I mean, they are there on paper, but nobody is occupying those positions. So if I, as an investor, has an argument with a regulator, I can technically go to the appellate tribunal, but there is nobody occupying that chair. So I can go there and wait for months on end because there is nobody to listen to me. So there is the main regulator, there are the appellate tribunals, and then there is the competition commissioner. And clarity is hopefully going to emerge, but like many other things, it will emerge over the next 10, 15 years. It's not going to emerge in 6 months. And so we do have an issue of whether we are going to attract investments. Kalpana mentioned $1 trillion. Prime Minister mentioned $1 trillion. Montek Singh Ahluwalia mentioned $1 trillion. So $1 trillion is the truth because everybody is mentioning that.
Particularly because I said it, number.
Sorry?
Particularly because I
Particularly when Kalpana says it must be true. But if you ask me, and if you ask Shailesh, who is probably much more vocal on such matters, $1 trillion at what rate of dollars? Maybe it's 7 rupees, like somebody mentioned earlier. So, money is not going to come in. We don't have so much of money available, either in debt or equity. Equity is a much bigger problem than debt. For investing $1 trillion, public, private, whatever you're talking about, we don't have. We have huge land acquisition issues, execution issues, etc. But even if we were to discount that $1 trillion and say, okay, it will be 600 billion, 500 billion, 700 billion, money is not going to come unless some of these issues are sorted out. Because I think we have, as a country, somewhat mistakenly thought that the initial money that came in primarily from Indian investor is going to be a big chunk of money coming in the future also. I think Indian investors have run out of their money. Their deep pockets are not deep enough anymore. So we need international money, and international money so far has really not come in a significant way. It will not come if we continue to behave like these are not important issues. I may sound negative, I don't know, but I believe that every time we go on a road show, the ministry or whoever goes on a road show, we all make nice diagrams to say $1 trillion, 50% from PPP, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, if you really look at how much true dollar money has come into the road sector, or any of these sectors that we are talking about, it's very, very nominal. And that's because of the reason that there is no certainty, there is no clarity, one doesn't know the applicability. And so money is available, it is looking for investment destinations, we should attract it, but we have to recognize that we need to attract it by doing some of these things. It will take time, but it has to be done, and I'm reasonably hopeful that the wiser sense will prevail, and over the next 2-3 years, people will do the right thing.
One of the thoughts that I have is that regulatory framework, regulations in India have often happened as an afterthought. So if I were to look at the road sector, for example, till 3 years ago, I had a whole host of investors in the sector, and I had a whole host of companies or businesses in the sector which were very keen to, expand their portfolios, get into more and more projects. And now, if I were to look at any inquiries or anything that we are currently involved in, there's not a single road project on it because of all the host of concerns which have come up. And I mean, one of the things I've heard repeated is that the regulatory environment needed to be, the framework needed to be in place before all these projects were put out to bid. So
I have a slightly different take on that. If you really look at whatever has happened in the road sector, perhaps the main reason why it has happened is because there has been no regulation. This is despite the fact, or perhaps because of the fact that there was no regulation, we have got a lot of investments. Maybe Indian investments, but it's happened. Look at power sector, we have had a whole lot of regulation. We have had the Electricity Act, we have had regulators in place in all the states. Is there money coming in? No, it's not coming. So one should really be questioning whether regulation of the type that we have is something that is desirable. Either you do a good job or you don't do it. Please don't do a bad job. Because if you do a bad job, the chances that you get nothing is very high. Look at the port sector. We have a regulator for more than 10 years, TAMP, Tariff Authority for Major Ports. I don't know what the thinking was behind bringing in a TAMP. But if you go and say that there are 10 players in the market and I will regulate 5 of them and I will not regulate 5 of them, I think there is a fundamental flaw in that. You cannot be saying I will regulate some but not all. So Tariff Authority for Major Ports regulates only major ports, whereas minor ports or ports owned by private sector in the states and so on are not regulated. Period. So somebody has to give a proper thought to these and say that look, we need to bring in a proper regulation. Today we are talking about regulation in the airline space. I can tell you, I think the airline industry has bloomed. We have a whole lot of airlines coming in. Market forces are dictating some airlines to go down and some airlines to pick up. We do have airlines which are doing pretty well, and we do have airlines which have gone down. It's not because of any regulation, it is simply because of certain investments and management and so on. But today, if we bring in a regulation of the type we have done in other sectors, I can assure you that the airline industry will definitely die a natural death in a few years. It has to be done properly or it should not be done at all. And in an industry where there is enough and more competition, I think it is important to say that, look, let the market forces play. If somebody wants to price themselves at a ridiculously low price and go down after 3 years, fine, let the banks be more careful before lending money to them. Government need not say that I will put a minimum. There was a recent move, and quite a shocking one, that ministry officials wrote to the airlines saying, please don't price yourself so low. I can't understand why would anybody do that. If they want to go down, it's their funeral, literally. Yes, you can advise the banks as the owner of banks that please don't lend to some irrational and ridiculously low-priced airlines. But instead of that, you should not be telling airlines to reduce, not to reduce prices. I mean, this goes completely against consumer thinking. So I would be very hesitant to say that it should be regulation in all sectors. Please do a thorough job. Take 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and do a proper job, or don't do it at all.
Harsh, would you like to add to that? You are public sector infrastructure investment company.
I would partly echo that. Too much of a regulation sometimes is certainly referred to as over-regulation. And since we are in the developmental phase, I think some of these principles, in my opinion, if they evolve through what we are doing, would be better. Rather than just copying some principles from abroad and putting in an act or putting in some kind of framework and labeling this as regulator 1, 2, 3, 4 or across territorial lines. So I am fundamentally, he referred to road sector. In fact, if you look at roads, absence of a regulator, this is the most vibrant sector in the infrastructure space today. And despite he referred to also the fact that very many people are not coming forward to bid, then it is not because of regulator being there or not being there. It is primarily because of reasons which are financial or which are other than financial, but not related to regulator. So I feel, but at the same time I would say, infrastructure in India requires long-term funds. And infrastructure in India, if the initial hiccups are overcome, is going to be a paying sector. We have, I can't give you the figure, where the state governments as well as the central government is supporting various through their annual budgets also in the form of annuities. They are not totally dependent on the market forces. So it could be a combination of what you earn actually from what the moving economy is. Also, in spite of that, there is a combination of certain projects which offer you a steady return. And with the financial sector being reasonably well regulated, I feel the interest of some of the long-term investors in the country, as earlier was some of them emphasized on the equity part, I would say debt is equally safe. In fact, we have large number of private-public partnerships, and in private-public partnership projects, the debt gets a real priority over the equity. And if you are thinking of a steady return, then I would say it is not a bad option, because you have termination clause payments also. And if you satisfy certain conditions, then your money is going to be safe. At least 90% of the money is going to be quite safe. So I would say that absence, we have to go each sector. And I would be one who would say let's have an evolving framework for regulation. Some of it could even self-regulation. In fact, little going away from infrastructure space, we had a very vibrant microfinance sector some years ago. We started talking about regulating it because numbers were going up. We were getting huge collections, repayments were good, everybody was excited about it. Some state government, some initiative somewhere tried to regulate it, the entire movement fizzled out in that particular area. So why can't we look at some kind of a self-regulation as well? This has not yet been tried in infrastructure space, but yes, some of the people are working on it. Some sectors which are really in infancy, there's a point in it. And where the subjects are not very clearly spelled out, because we have, in the Constitution says we have state subjects, we have concurrent subjects, we have central subjects. So, especially if you are in the concurrent subject, there is a duality. So, in duality, it is difficult to say that who is going to, although the fear of the center is going to prevail. The Constitution also provides the same. But at the same time, all these, because nobody has taken the initiative, there was a reference to water, sanitation. I think why do we have to have a regulator upfront? Let some creative projects emerge. And if we find something which is not as per the expectations of the policy, or some performance-related things have to be there, then those could be regulated. So I am saying we have to be very, very specific and choosy. Wherever regulation can support development, because we need them. We need long-term infrastructure development in this country. That regulation is welcome, be it an external agency, be it limited agencies, be it divided agencies, or be it self-regulation. But certain sectors, I think we should not be talking about regulation as of now. Yes, some of my foreign investors would look at it a little differently, but I would say absence of a regulator can also at times be a bliss.
So what Harsh is saying is, let there be chaos. Once there is enough chaos and crisis created, then we create a regulatory framework.
Chaos can come from anyone.
That's true. But just Himal has mentioned about the international investor, the foreign investor, and one of the concerns on the top of their mind is what kind of structures are good for us to come in, keeping the regulatory aspects in mind as well as their ability to realize or the returns that they are looking for from infrastructure investments here in India. So I'm sure some of our Canadian friends would be very keen to know, to understand what is it that they might want to keep in mind and what kind of structures they could look at when they are looking at the huge opportunity in India's infrastructure space.
Sure. So a lot of people who are practicing tax and foreign investments in India probably, like me, probably have sold Mauritius, Cyprus, and Singapore n number of times. So I'm talking about Mauritius from last 12 years. I only been once. The point is that the entire gimmick of structuring on the equity return is all about taking the money or the returns out of India in the most tax efficient manner, so that your overall return improves in your home country. The unfortunate reality of today, what is happening is that by whatever manner we invest in India, somewhere or other, every finance bill which comes up, it plugs one by one loopholes. Or probably, I don't want to say loopholes, it plugs one by one opportunity of repatriating funds. That's a better word. Now, from Canada, I work with multiple investors from Canada who have invested in India, and they prefer maybe Singapore or Cyprus over Mauritius to enter India. It can be like foreign direct investment, which is a very simple, plain equity investment. Maybe can come through a debt. The recent window is the qualified foreign investor. There's another opportunity of foreign venture capital investor, which is opened up for a lot of investors, but it doesn't work for a strategic investor. It works for more of the funds, because they are in the investment business. The benefit of FVCI certainly is that the valuation law doesn't apply to India, so the deals can be structured based on the upside of the project, the completion of the project, the timely implementation of the project. So there are ways and means of doing structures given tight situation what India is undergoing and what tax laws are undergoing. Currently, in this budget, they have also blocked buyback of shares. We are talking to government and doing representation on how can we streamline the entire proposition what they have. But having said that, still today also there are opportunities available by way of structuring it differently to take money, if not completely tax-free, maybe the 10% minimum tax, which is obviously a very big cost in India, if you get a credit in your home country. I think if that law is clarified, I'm sure many investors would be really happy to pay 10% in India and take a credit in home country.
Would you be?
I expect a big yes entirely to invest.
I thought it would be interesting to hear what your experience in the last 10 years with the environment has been. And I would imagine you've been a profitable business and you've been able to repatriate some of this back to Canada. It will be really interesting. And if you have any thoughts to share with potential investors and how they could structure it, that might be useful as well.
I think the experience that we've had, certainly one of the phenomena we've seen at Bombardier in the last little bit of investment into India is, I always hear the same topic, it's, well, we can't have cash trapped, because you'll have cash trapped in India, you'll never come back to corporate office. And I think that there's also a method, I mean, without going into the greater detail, there is a method to structure your business in a specific manner in order to avoid as much as possible what we call cash trapping. I think Bombardier has been quite successful, either with its entities in Singapore, and the structuring. I think that the advice I would give to the investors is the methods in which you structure your legal entities in order to avoid the phenomenon of cash trapping. And I know that since specifically 2006, we've done a lot in terms of molding our entities that already exist, and how the money is brought into India and how it is brought out, in order to, of course, ensure to do things per the regulations, but also avoiding the phenomenon of cash trapping. My advice to investors is how to structure your legal entities, and on that one, your legal advisors can certainly give you the best background on that. Maybe one thing I'd like to add is relating to what I think Amrit had said a bit earlier about competition law. In India, one has to remember that competition law is quite new. So we look at the Competition Act and the methods it's been interpreted, and moving forward to now, we can see a lot of change within the Commission. There's been, within the last few months, major changes. But again, I think that I go back to the principle of applicability. We need to make sure that the investors feel the comfort that they're not going to engage in any antitrust practices. And also educating the ministries within India is a task in itself, whether it's central or per state, on what are the competition law aspects and regulations that we need to make sure we look after. And I think that's been a positive experience working with the CCI, the Compact, the Appellate Tribunal. I think it's moving in the right direction on how can industry also assist the regulator in making the industry bring forward its perspective.
Okay. One question which I think what I'd like to do is throw it out open to all the audience, and because we have a panel sitting here which I'm sure there would be queries to be addressed to. Just two more questions before we move to the audience. In terms of the tax incentives, are there any which you find more attractive, more interesting? And I'm going to come back to you on that as a final point. But I thought it would be an interesting point to be probably made out to potential investors. Perhaps I'm pitching for India as an investment destination.
I think for me, not being the greatest tax expert, but I think for me what is senvatable under service tax is something that is interesting in India. However, again, the understanding of that process needs to be clearly defined with your tax department. Because yes, it's very attractive, I find. However, it needs to be properly understood. Otherwise, it can lead to the total other way of being tax evasion.
Hemant? This is your question, really. And I thought you had a user perspective before we go.
So actually, I echo his voice. I would also expect the regulators or the tax authorities to have a very clear understanding of the segment credit. Correct. I think that has been challenging in the system. The clarity is not there in most of the credits which should be available.
And probably, Amrit, I'll start with you. So. I'm just going to ask you to probably focus on or talk about making a pitch to all the foreign investors, the Canadian investors, as to, despite some of the shortcomings, which is having too much regulation in the wrong place and having perhaps regulation which nobody seems to agree on in other sectors, what are some of the areas which you think are the area of opportunity which you believe, since you said we don't need the investments to come in any case, whether domestically or from overseas or from the government as the case may be?
No, I think for a moment one will have to forget the complications of the regulations and all the negative that you have heard in the last 2 minutes, and look back and say that over the next 20, 30 years, do we see this country as a good market for whatever we are here for? If you are an infrastructure developer, do you see this country as a good market? And I think that is what should really be the main reason why you should consider, because there is a fundamental market. We do have a fairly low per capita income. We are growing. Various estimates today, Modi says post 2014 you will grow at 7%, which is good news for us. But whether it is 6% or 7%, it is unlikely to be 2% or 1%. And if you have a 6 or 7% growth over the next 15, 20 years, it is a pretty good growth. And we have seen that in the last 10 years, the disposable income of people have gone up. People have started demanding better quality infrastructure from the government, from private, from whoever. So fundamentally, there is a market. Market is growing. So you will have to be ready to go through the complex regulations, complex processes, complex cash traps, and so on. Because at the end of the day, it is worth it. But having said that, this is not a short-haul market. You got to come here for next 20, 30 years, not for next 5 years. You may have to struggle. You may have to spend a lot of time and effort in understanding because as many people have said, this is not one country. So if you know how to do business in Maharashtra, it means nothing when you go to West Bengal. It means actually nothing when you go to West Bengal, even if you have done business in West Bengal. But all the same, I think it is important to consider India as a next 20, 30 year market. Persuade your top management and your boards and your directors and whoever that look, we are not looking at this as what has happened next 2 years. Things will, they go 3 steps ahead, come back 2 steps, and back and forth will happen. But this vision, this market is pretty good. And we do have the second fundamental advantage that a substantial part of the talent that you would need to do whatever business you're doing is actually available here. It's trainable, it's hardworking, it's committed, and therefore it's not that you will find it extremely difficult to deliver whatever you've taken on. So if you look at these, I'm sure you'll go back and do your numbers and find that there are not too many places around the world which are giving you a reasonable good assurance on the market and talent side. And that is what should really drive you to then come and say that, okay, now how do we move in this maze of regulations and policies and understanding all this and so on and so forth.
So what Amrit is saying that the return is well worth the pain of navigating the regulation, basically. That's what he's saying over a period of time. On that note, can we throw it open to all of you? If you have any queries to the panelists, they'll be more than happy to read those.
Perhaps tea time.
Thank you. One question at least, else we need to get worried.
It's not a question, it's more a recommendation to the organizers. If you could perhaps make videos of these different panel discussions and send a copy to any of the young ministers or the bureaucracy who actually will make changes, because I don't see any of them in the room today. They were there in the morning and then disappeared. So my suggestion to the organizers, if you can make that happen, it will be more worthwhile. Thank you.
I think we've...
Your request has been recorded.
Your request has been recorded. That is what we aim to do, is to bring it to their notice so that things can be done, not just leave it at this.
No, you can see they were all here. Okay.
It's okay. I think the same thing that we are planning this to be a starting point and not the end. So we will take this forward.
I was almost worried that I didn't take care of my coiffure well enough and these videos might be heading to Bollywood and all. Any other observations, comments, questions, queries?
Excuse me.
Give the mic.
Yes. Just it is to support Mr. Harsha that that the regulator, if it is not there in evolving sector, it's better. But sometimes it is even better even if it is not there at all. As we see in IT sector in India, it could grow because there was no regulator. And now there is always a talk in every parliamentary session that it may come and it may be regulated and all. So I don't know what is the better idea for investments. Just an idea on.
You almost said it. IT has not been regulated, so it's done so well. But at the same time, we, especially in the financial sector, we have to come up with expectations of the person from where money is coming. And since we need to organize ourselves in terms of what returns we have to pay, and to what extent, what risks we have to take, etc., etc., etc. We have to put internal policies, which we call self-regulation. Every institution which is doing well has it today. Or also, if not, then you are dealing with public money. So some kind of regulation, at least for investments, has to be there. Investments, the way they are particularly domestic, we can categorize domestic as well as external. Could be short term, could be long term. We have seen some examples in country-specific instances I will not quote, but unless it is given some direction, I am not using the word regulation, it could be catastrophic for countries. So there has to be some mechanism to regulate it. We are strongly a firm believer of say, not that I am coming from a state-owned financial entity, but this is as an investor also, because I am banking, I am depositing my money somewhere. So I want some kind of safety, some kind of short returns. I think our regulators, particularly in the financial sector, are dutifully doing their job. But yes, at the same time, many particular, especially to policy changes or the needs for different sectors have to be responded to, and that has been happening as well. We have been talking about exposure limits, we've been talking about provisioning norms, we've been talking about capital adequacy, and particularly a separate treatment for infrastructure. And that has come up. Some points have been certainly considered. So I think with this, I would thank you for supporting me, but I would have slightly different.
Sir, just coming to the age-old question of debt versus equity. I mean, even in an infrastructure sector, which is considered to be a higher premium sector as far as risk is concerned, your real returns are actually negative. Your returns from debt on infrastructure is less than the inflation, annual inflation that you are seeing in government published numbers. So how do you see as means to overcome the challenges and try to bring in positive real returns to investors, which is exactly what they would be looking at in the first place, especially if they are investing for a longer period of time, say 15, 20 years. Because for over that long period of time, if you have negative real returns, then you are seeing erosion in capital rather than making money on it. Me? Yes, sir.
I would talk about it with our own experience, rather than talking in general.
Sure.
We have financed we've sanctioned close to 300 projects in this country in infrastructure. Out of that, I find around 15-20% projects are such which are giving positive inflation-negated returns. At least I would say 20 to 25% projects are there. And I'm talking about 40% of the projects are such because of certain reasons which are related to policy, which are related to clearances, etc., are getting delayed. So these projects are having cost overruns. So those are the projects, if they are completed on time, probably many of them also would not be having a negative return on whatever you're financing, particularly negative. But yes, nobody would like to have a negative return, and it's a challenge for any kind of institution to assure some kind of inflation indexed return to its investors. I think some of us are working on that. And also, recent focus has been in infrastructure financing has been on consolidation. We are seeing larger number of deals which are for projects which are already operating. So renegotiated terms and better returns. And newer projects, since we have already in this country, we have limited number of developers. And there are strict exposure norms. So that is one issue which is bothering the entire financing system. But that also needs to be taken care of, and ultimately, I feel if new building starts up, which will start up sometime, we can't go on postponing the entire exercise of not dealing with the issues. And the government is concerned particularly on clearances. Because road is one sector which probably can give the more stable returns compared to other sectors. Also, ports have some challenges in terms of coal not coming to the ports, etc., has also seen some negative traffic. But some of the other sectors have had a positive this thing. At the same time, products need to be designed in such a fashion that, rightly said, negative return, minus the inflation, nobody will want to have that. That's a challenge.